Imagine, if you will, a kingdom cloaked in a deep, weary twilight. Not the sudden, dramatic descent of night, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading of light, stretching across generations. This was France in the early 15th century, a land holding its breath, caught in the long, quiet shadow of a conflict that seemed endless. The very air seemed to carry a subtle weight, a pervasive sense of exhaustion that settled over quiet villages and neglected fields. Generations had known little but the distant hum of conflict, a low thrum beneath the surface of daily life, a constant reminder of a world perpetually on edge. Hope, once a vibrant flame, had dwindled to a flickering ember, leaving a quiet weariness in its wake. It was a time when the future felt uncertain, shrouded in a quiet despair, and the collective sigh of a nation yearned for a dawn that seemed impossibly far away. In this profound stillness, a subtle yearning for change began to stir, a quiet longing for a guiding light to break through the encroaching darkness. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always intriguing to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our journey into this twilight era commences with a deep exploration of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had long cast its weary shadow across the landscape of France. This intermittent struggle, lasting from 1337 to 1453, was not a continuous, intense period of fighting, but rather a series of armed conflicts between England and France, punctuated by periods of uneasy truce. For generations, this persistent, draining presence quietly reshaped the very fabric of life, settling like a fine dust over the fields and villages, leaving a quiet weariness in its wake. Imagine the subtle, ever-present hum of distant conflict, a low thrum beneath the surface of daily life, a constant reminder of a world perpetually on edge. The air itself might have carried the faint scent of wood smoke from distant, ravaged villages, or the quiet, mournful cry of a lone bird over fallow fields, untouched by the plough for fear of unseen dangers. The deep-seated tensions that ignited this prolonged struggle can be traced back centuries, to the Norman conquest of 1066. This pivotal event placed English monarchs, as Dukes of Normandy and later Aquitaine, in a complex and often contentious position. They were powerful rulers in their own right, yet simultaneously vassals to the French king for their continental lands. This inherent conflict of loyalty and sovereignty constantly threatened French royal authority and served as a root cause of much of the medieval conflict between the two monarchies, a quiet, simmering resentment that occasionally boiled over into open hostility. The immediate catalyst for the war's formal commencement was the dynastic dispute that arose in 1328, following the death of King Charles IV of France without a direct male heir. Edward III of England, through his mother Isabella, sister of the deceased Charles IV, asserted his claim to the French throne, believing his lineage granted him the right to inherit. However, the French nobility, adhering to the Salic law which explicitly excluded female succession and inheritance through the female line, favored Philip VI of the House of Valois, who was subsequently crowned. This legal and political divergence laid the groundwork for a century of quiet, yet profound, contention. Early English victories, such as the decisive Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, showcased the formidable effectiveness of the English longbow against traditional French cavalry, leading to significant territorial gains for England and the capture of French King John II. These engagements marked a subtle, yet profound, shift in military strategies, quietly challenging the established norms of chivalric warfare and introducing a new, more efficient, and often more devastating approach to the battlefield. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415, under the leadership of Henry V, further solidified English dominance, despite the French often outnumbering them. While we will not dwell on the grim specifics of these battles, their cumulative impact on French morale was immense, contributing to a pervasive sense of quiet despair and a feeling that the very spirit of France was slowly being extinguished. The echoes of these defeats, though not loud, resonated deeply within the collective consciousness, a quiet weight on the nation's soul. By 1422, the English and their Burgundian allies had achieved a peak of dominance, controlling Aquitaine and virtually all of France north of the Loire River, including the vital city of Paris. This extensive control underscored the seemingly insurmountable challenges facing France. The cumulative effect of these intermittent conflicts, marked by pervasive economic strain, disrupted trade routes, and heavy taxation, had led to widespread hardship for both peasants and nobles. Imagine the quiet desperation in the eyes of a peasant, whose fields might be trampled by passing armies, or whose meager harvest was taken by a tax collector, leaving families with little more than the quiet gnawing of hunger. Homes were abandoned, falling apart as their occupants fled, and even wolves, driven by hunger, roamed the countryside, digging up corpses or jumping over walls in search of food, a stark image of a land in quiet disarray. This was not merely a military crisis but a slow, systemic erosion of national well-being, leaving the populace with a deep, quiet weariness and a longing for peace. The very air seemed to hang heavy with unspoken anxieties, a collective sigh of a nation yearning for respite, a quiet longing for the dawn after a long, dark night. Beneath this long shadow of external conflict, France also grappled with a quieter, yet equally corrosive, internal struggle. The very heart of the kingdom, its monarchy, was experiencing a profound and delicate challenge. King Charles VI, who began his reign as the Beloved, but later became known, more poignantly, as the Mad, suffered from a perplexing affliction that cast a deep uncertainty over his rule, leaving a quiet vacuum at the center of power. His condition was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a series of recurrent mental illnesses and psychotic episodes that plague him throughout his life, often manifesting in unpredictable ways. His first major attack of delirium occurred in 1392, during a military expedition, where he tragically attacked his own men in the forest of Le Mans, a chilling moment that signaled the onset of his long struggle. He endured numerous distinct psychiatric episodes, including the unusual glass delusion, where he believed his body was brittle and susceptible to shattering, a quiet torment that isolated him further from his court and kingdom. This chronic mental instability created a significant power vacuum, which was eagerly exploited by influential figures within the court. His powerful uncles, such as Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, sought to exert control, their ambitions quietly clashing in the hushed corridors of power. His younger brother, Louis I, Duke of Orléans, also aspired to regency and saw his influence grow, adding another layer of quiet tension to the royal household, as the very fabric of governance began to fray. This struggle for control between powerful factions, primarily the House of Orléans, known as the Armagnacs, and the House of Burgundy, escalated into the devastating Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War, which raged from 1407 to 1435. This internal conflict further weakened France, diverting precious resources and attention from the external threat posed by England. It was a quiet, insidious war, fought not always on grand battlefields, but in the subtle shifts of allegiance, the whispered intrigues, and the calculated betrayals that slowly unraveled the kingdom from within. John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, a figure described as a rash, ruthless, and unscrupulous politician, murdered Louis I of Orleans in 1407 in an attempt to gain control of the government. This act of violence, though not explicitly detailed in its grimness, had profound repercussions, deepening the internal divisions and casting a long, quiet shadow of mistrust over the French nobility. The Civil War was further inflamed by the assassination of John the Fearless himself in 1419, during what he believed was a diplomatic meeting with the Dauphin Charles on the bridge at Montereau. This event directly prompted John's son and successor, Philip the Good, to form a crucial alliance with the English, thereby bringing the 100 Years' War to its critical final phase. The quiet, almost imperceptible shift of this alliance was like a slow-moving river changing its course, altering the entire landscape of the conflict and deepening the sense of internal decay. This historical progression reveals a profound pattern. France's internal political fragmentation and civil conflict were not merely co-occurring with the 100 Years' War. They were causally linked and mutually reinforcing. The quiet erosion of authority at the top, stemming from the king's illness and the ensuing power struggles, created deep fissures that allowed the external English pressure to penetrate and exploit, weakening France from within. This created a pervasive sense of quiet despair and hopelessness, a feeling that the very foundations of the kingdom were crumbling, making the need for a unifying, external force even more poignant. The nation was quietly consuming itself from within while under siege from without. And this pervasive vulnerability sets the stage for a deeper understanding of the profound need for Joan's unique intervention. The silence of the court, broken only by the rustle of silks and the hushed whispers of courtiers, masked a profound and growing emptiness at the heart of the kingdom, a quiet yearning for a voice that could cut through the pervasive doubt and offer a new direction. The weight of this internal strife, a silent burden, pressed down upon the land, making every breath a quiet struggle. In this fractured kingdom, the young Dauphin, Charles, found himself in a profoundly isolated and precarious position. He was the 11th child of Charles VI and Isabella of Bavaria, and the unexpected deaths of his elder brothers eventually made him the heir to the throne in April 1417, at the tender age of 14. Yet, his inheritance was a crown without a kingdom, a title steeped in quiet despair, a heavy burden resting upon young shoulders. His early life was marked by the tumultuous French court, where intrigue, luxury, and profligacy prevailed amidst frequent crises caused by his father's mental instability. Imagine the quiet tension in the royal palace, the hushed conversations, the sudden, unpredictable outbursts of the king, all contributing to a sense of unease that permeated Charles's formative years. In May 1413, rioting Parisians even invaded the Hotel St. Paul, where he resided with his family, a stark and unsettling glimpse into the fragility of royal authority and the quiet dangers that lurked even within the capital. Further compounding his difficulties, his own mother, Isabella of Bavaria, abandoned Paris and allied herself with John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, leading to Charles's forced flight from Paris in May 1418 when the Burgundians occupied the capital. This quiet betrayal, the sense of being cast adrift by his own family, must have settled deep within him, adding to his profound sense of isolation. The infamous Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420 by his mentally ill father Charles VI and Queen Isabeau, formally disinherited Charles VII, declaring Henry V of England and his heirs as the rightful successors to the French throne. This profound act of disinheritance was further justified by a disinformation campaign promoted by the Burgundians, claiming Charles was illegitimate, and by his alleged involvement in John the Fearless assassination. In 1421, after failing to appear for a legal summons, Charles was formally condemned in a Parisian court for treason and banished from France, losing all privileges to land and titles. This legal stripping of his birthright, though a quiet bureaucratic act, was a devastating blow to his legitimacy and his spirit, leaving him with a quiet, knowing doubt about his own destiny. Upon his father's death in 1422, Charles VII claimed the title of King of France, but he ruled only a fragmented third of the realm, primarily the land south of the Loire River, from his de facto capital of Bourges. His opponents, in a gesture of derision, often referred to him as the King of Bourges, a quiet insult that underscored his diminished status and the precariousness of his claim. He faced severe financial difficulties, with insufficient taxes forcing him to mortgage lands and borrow heavily for financiers and nobles, a constant, quiet struggle to maintain even the semblance of a royal court. His army suffered significant setbacks, notably at Verneuil in August 1424, further eroding his confidence and the morale of his remaining loyalists. By October 1428, when the English laid siege to Orléans, Charles, at 25 years old, had known only war and the worst of intrigue for 12 years. He was deeply discouraged, contemplating retirement to Spain or even ceding to English pressure, a quiet surrender to the overwhelming tide of misfortune that seemed to engulf his every effort. Although his court at Bourges was described as being in an atmosphere of utter hopelessness and despair, it still attracted many, suggesting a quiet yearning for leadership and a glimmer of hope amidst the gloom, a silent testament to the enduring loyalty of some. He was often surrounded by self-serving advisors, such as Georges de la Tremoille, whose influence frequently obstructed efforts beneficial to the kingdom for personal gain, even attempting to obtain a separate treaty with Burgundy and potentially influencing the king's failure to secure Joan's release later. The quiet machinations of these advisors added another layer of burden to Charles's already heavy crown, making his lonely vigil even more profound. This comprehensive portrayal paints not just a picture of political weakness, but of a deep psychological burden on Charles VII. He was not merely a king without a kingdom, but a young man carrying the immense weight of a seemingly lost cause, surrounded by intrigue, doubt, and even questioning his own legitimacy. This quiet despair, a persistent internal sense of hopelessness, created a unique vulnerability. It suggests that his dire circumstances, his profound sense of being adrift, and the repeated failures of conventional political and military strategies made him uniquely open to an unconventional, even miraculous, intervention like Joan of Arc. Her arrival was not just a potential military reinforcement, but a profound psychological and spiritual intervention for the Dauphin himself, offering a quiet, unexpected path forward when all traditional avenues seemed closed. This deepens the narrative's emotional resonance in a calming, reflective way, highlighting the human element in a time of profound historical crisis, a quiet yearning for a guiding light in the encroaching darkness. And so, in this landscape of quiet desperation, one city stood as a solitary, flickering ember of French hope, Orléans. Situated strategically on the Loire River, it was more than just a city. It was the last loyal bastion, a silent sentinel guarding the heart of what remained of the French kingdom, a city holding its breath in the face of an encroaching tide. The very stones of its ancient walls seemed to absorb the collective anxiety of its inhabitants, a quiet hum of apprehension that permeated the narrow streets and bustling markets, a palpable sense of waiting. Orléans held immense strategic and symbolic significance for both sides of the conflict. Its capture by the English would have provided a crucial bridgehead across the Loire River, allowing them to further invade southern France and potentially realize King Henry V's dream of conquering all of France. By 1428, with English and Burgundian forces controlling much of northern France, Orléans remained a vital stronghold for the Dauphin, representing one of the few remaining loyal regions south of the Loire. It was a quiet defiance, a stubborn refusal to yield, that resonated through the beleaguered kingdom, a last stand against the encroaching darkness. The city's very existence was a quiet challenge to English dominance, a beacon of resistance in a land largely subdued. The siege formally commenced on October 12, 1428. English forces, initially led by the highly regarded Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, and later by the Earl of Suffolk and John Lord Talbot, aimed to starve the city into submission through encirclement rather than a direct, costly assault. Salisbury's strategic approach involved sweeping through the countryside southwest of Paris, seizing key towns like Monceau and Beaugency, and then meticulously approaching Orléans from the south, specifically targeting its crucial bridge, which was nearly a quarter-mile long and connected the city to the south bank of the Loire. The methodical nature of the English advance, a slow tightening of the noose, must have instilled a quiet dread within the city walls, a creeping sense of inevitability. After Salisbury's death, command fell to the Earl of Suffolk, who, lacking Salisbury's aggressive temperament, moved his army into winter quarters, leaving Sir William Glassdale to hold the critical Les Tourelles fortifications. However, the arrival of John Lord Talbot in December 1428 prompted the English to resume the active siege, renewing the quiet pressure on the city. The city's defenses were formidable, featuring strong walls and effective artillery, a testament to the quiet determination of its builders and defenders. Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orléans and commander of the French garrison, correctly anticipated the English focus on the bridge and took care to prepare the city for siege. To deny the English cover, the southern suburbs of Orléans were evacuated, and all structures were leveled by French orders, a quiet sacrifice for the greater defense, leaving a desolate landscape around the city's formidable walls. Despite being significantly outnumbered, the English army comprised around 10,000 men, while the French garrison included 2,400 troops, 3,000 militia, and approximately 30,000 townspeople. The city's defenders mounted a resilient, if weary, defense. The inhabitants, hidden away in their extraordinary walled enclosure, resisted for 7 months, awaiting reinforcements, their lives a quiet testament to endurance. However, morale among the French garrison and populace was notably low before Joan's arrival, particularly after setbacks such as the Battle of the Herrings, where a French supply convoy was routed, leaving a quiet sense of despair in its wake. The quiet despair, the gnawing uncertainty, had begun to take its toll, a subtle erosion of spirit despite the strong physical defenses. The city, though physically strong, was quietly vulnerable, its spirit slowly dimming under the relentless, silent pressure of the siege. In the quiet, unassuming village of Domrémy, nestled in the northeastern reaches of France, a young peasant girl named Jean d'Arc, or Joan, lived a life steeped in the rhythms of the land and the gentle teachings of faith. Born around 1412, she was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc, a tenant farmer, and Isabelle Romy, a pious woman who instilled in her a deep love for the Catholic Church and its teachings, a quiet foundation for the extraordinary path she would eventually walk. Domrémy itself was a place of humble tranquility, where livestock provided the main income, and vast forests covered more than half the land, offering a serene backdrop to daily life. The air would have carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, the distant bleating of sheep, and the soft rustle of leaves in the ancient trees, a world far removed from the clamor of war. Life for a peasant girl in 15th century France was one of quiet industry and simple routines. Joan, like others in her village, was not taught to read or write. Her education came from the fields, the hearth, and the unwavering faith passed down by her mother. Her days would have been filled with the quiet chores of the homestead, tending to animals, collecting fuel, making and repairing simple farm tools, spinning wool, and weaving cloth. Imagine the rhythmic hum of a spinning wheel, the gentle clatter of pottery in the kitchen, or the soft murmur of prayers whispered before a simple meal of bread, porridge, and vegetable soup. These were lives of self-sufficiency, where communities were tightly knit, and the quiet rhythm of the seasons dictated their existence. Payments to the church and nobility were often made in produce, such as wheat or butter, a tangible connection to the land that sustained them. Even bathing was a simple affair, often in a local river or stream, or with buckets of cold water, a testament to the practicalities of their humble lives. Yet, even in this quiet corner of France, the distant shadow of the 100 Years' War occasionally touched their lives. Domrémy was situated on the border of Champagne and Bar, a region often caught between the shifting allegiances of the French kingdom and the encroaching English and Burgundian forces. In 1425, the very year Joan turned 13, English and Burgundian forces drove off all of Domrémy's cattle and even burned parts of the town, a quiet trauma that brought the distant conflict uncomfortably close to home. It was in this tumultuous year, amidst the quiet anxieties of a war-torn land, that Joan began to experience something extraordinary. Intervention, but also deeply cautious. Around noon one day, as she stood in her father's garden, a bright light appeared from the direction of the church, and a voice spoke to her. This was the first of her voices, which she came to recognize as divine commands from God, delivered through the Archangel Michael, and later, Saints Catherine and Margaret. These were not fleeting whispers, but clear, distinct messages, often accompanied by a bright light, and sometimes heard more distinctly when church bells sounded, as if the sacred chimes amplified the divine communication. Joan, who had learned of these crucial French saints through statuary in her village church and her mother's careful religious instruction, believed implicitly in their reality. She even claimed to have clasped Saints Catherine and Margaret in embraces, recalling that they had smelled wonderful, a testament to the vividness of her spiritual experiences. Initially, the messages were simple and brief, guiding her to live piously and attend church often. But over time, these quiet instructions grew longer, more detailed, and profoundly insistent. The voices began to reveal a mission of overwhelming importance. She was chosen by God to save France by expelling its enemies and to install Charles as its rightful king. This divine mandate, delivered in French, became an increasingly central part of how Joan processed and perceived reality, shaping her quiet determination. She was told, repeatedly, that she must leave her home and go to France, a command that would set her on an improbable journey, a gentle stirring in the heart of a simple peasant girl destined for an extraordinary purpose. This quiet, internal calling, born in the tranquility of a garden, was the subtle beginning of a profound shift in the destiny of a nation. With her divine mission now clear, Joan, at the tender age of 16, faced the daunting task of convincing the skeptical world around her. Her first step was to seek out Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the royal garrison at Vaucouleurs, a nearby stronghold loyal to the Dauphin Charles. Imagine the quiet determination in her young eyes as she, a simple peasant girl, approached a military commander, dressed in her humble red women's clothing, and declared that she was sent by God to save France. Initially, Baudricourt, a minor figure of 15th century French nobility, did not take her seriously. He dismissed her claims, perhaps with a quiet chuckle or dismissive wave of the hand, seeing her as nothing more than a deluded girl. Vaucouleurs, however, was not a large town, and Joan's persistence made it difficult to avoid. She would corner him in public places, lecturing everyone present, holding them spellbound with her unwavering conviction, and subtly putting public pressure on Baudricourt to assist her. Her quiet resolve, her unshakable belief in her divine mandate, began to chip away at his skepticism. She prophesied a significant French military defeat, the Battle of the Herrings, which occurred in February 1429, further lending credence to her claims and subtly swaying opinion in her favor. Finally, Baudricourt relented. He provided Joan with a small escort of soldiers to bring her to the royal court at Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles and his court resided. Before setting out, Joan willingly adopted men's clothing, including a tunic, spades, leggings, and a sword, a practical decision for a perilous journey through war-torn lands, and one that would later become a point of contention. The inhabitants of Vaucouleurs even had a man's suit made for her, and a horse was procured, a quiet testament to the growing belief in her mission. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon was an arduous one, spanning 11 days through territory largely controlled by the English and Burgundians. Joan and her small company, including Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, traveled mostly at night, under the cloak of darkness, for fear of encountering enemy forces. Imagine the quiet anxieties of such a journey, the hushed whispers as they rode through moonlit forests, the distant sounds of the countryside, every shadow a potential threat. Despite the dangers, Joan's companions later recalled her unwavering faith. She would reassure them, "Have no fear. What I am commanded to do, I will do. And my brothers in paradise have told me how to act. It is 4 or 5 years since my brothers in paradise and my lord, that is, God, told me that I must go and fight in order to regain the kingdom of France." Her presence, even in the quiet vulnerability of travel, seemed to inspire a profound sense of goodness and protection in those around her. Jean de Metz, who often slept beside her fully dressed and armed, later testified that he never felt any carnal desire towards her, because of the great goodness which I saw in her. Along the way, they made a significant stop at Saint-Catherine-de-Fierbois, a village that had grown around a chapel dedicated to Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the patron saint of soldiers. Legend held that Charles Martel had left his sword behind the altar here after vanquishing the Meuse in the Battle of Poitiers in 732, and the chapel had become a renowned pilgrimage site, known for miracles and cures. It was here, guided by her voices, that Joan directed them to search for an ancient sword buried behind the altar. It was found, rusted, with 5 crosses on it, a quiet confirmation of her divine guidance that further solidified her conviction and the belief of her companions. This discovery, a subtle echo of ancient battles and divine favor, imbued her journey with a deepest sense of destiny. Upon arriving safely in Saint-Catherine-de-Fierbois, Joan sent a letter to King Charles VII, requesting entrance into Chinon and mentioning their arduous journey of 150 leagues to provide information that would benefit him. The journey itself, a quiet act of faith and perseverance across a fractured land, was a testament to the profound conviction that propelled this simple peasant girl towards her extraordinary destiny. Joan arrived at Chinon, the de facto capital of the beleaguered Dauphin, Charles VII, around noon on or about March 4, 1429, after her 11-day ride. The royal fortress of Chinon, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Vienne River, offered a relatively safe and discreet refuge for the future sovereign, a quiet haven amidst the turmoil of France. Its ancient walls, punctuated by towers illustrating centuries of defensive architecture, held within them the royal apartments of Charles VII and Marie of Anjou, an elegant stone dwelling with turrets and mullioned windows. The Great Hall, though now disappeared, was known as the Recognition Hall, a place where history was about to be quietly, yet profoundly, made. Upon her arrival, Joan requested an audience with the king, but she was made to wait. Charles's counselors, wary and skeptical, debated whether such an audience should even be arranged. The court at Bourges, where Charles often resided, was an atmosphere of utter hopelessness and despair. Yet it still attracted many, suggesting a quiet yearning for leadership and a glimmer of hope. Charles himself was a figure burdened by quiet struggle and profound isolation, often surrounded by self-serving advisors like Georges de la Trémouille, who frequently obstructed efforts beneficial to the kingdom. His dire circumstances, his profound sense of being adrift, made him uniquely open to an unconventional intervention, but also deeply cautious. To test Joan's claims of divine guidance, Charles decided to trick her. When she was finally admitted to his chamber on or about March 9, 1429, he disguised himself, blending in with his courtiers, many of whom were dressed with more pomp and richness than the king himself. The Great Hall, a rectangular room, often higher than it was wide, would have been filled with the hushed murmurs of anticipation, the rustle of fine fabrics, and the subtle scent of wood smoke from the large fireplace. Despite the deception, Joan recognized him immediately. She reverently bowed before him, embracing his knees, and proclaimed, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." When Charles, still testing her, replied, "I am not the king," and pointed to another lord, Joan responded with unwavering conviction, "In God's name, gentle Dauphin, it is you and none other." This quiet act of recognition, witnessed by many, profoundly impressed those present, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of skepticism. Following this public meeting, a private conversation took place, during which Joan revealed a secret sign sent from God, which only Charles himself could recognize. The exact nature of this secret was never revealed by Joan, even under intense questioning at her trial, but it is widely believed to have addressed a deep doubt Charles harbored about the legitimacy of his birth, a quiet anxiety that had plagued him for years. Joan's chaplain, Father Pasquerel, later testified that Joan told Charles, "I tell thee, on behalf of Messiah, God, that thou art true heir of France and the king's son, and he has sent me to thee to lead thee to Reims, that thou may receive thy coronation and anointing, if thou wilt." This profound, private revelation, a quiet confirmation of his rightful claim to the throne, instilled in Charles a newfound confidence in Joan's divine mission. He consulted with her for hours, a quiet turning point in his own beleaguered spirit. The role of Yolande of Aragon, Charles's energetic and politically astute mother-in-law, was subtly crucial in this period. She had established her influence over Charles from a young age, acting as a substitute mother and protecting him from various plots. Yolande, known as the Queen of Four Kingdoms, and a figure of quiet political genius, had an extensive network of spies and contacts. She was instrumental in arranging the examination of Joan's virginity by an assembly of women, presided over by herself, and later ensured that Charles sent Joan to Poitiers for a thorough examination by theologians and advisors. For 3 weeks, Joan underwent rigorous scrutiny by high-ranking clergy, including the Archbishop of Reims and prominent theologians, at Poitiers. They found her to be free from flaws and authentic in her mission, concluding that nothing improper has been found in her, only good, humility, chastity, piety, propriety, simplicity. This quiet, yet authoritative, approval from the Church was a critical step, lending institutional legitimacy to Joan's extraordinary claims. Upon her return to Chinon between March 27 and April 5, Joan presented Charles with a gold crown, a tangible sign of a promise to lead him to his coronation at Reims, the traditional site of French royal investiture. With the theological examination complete and her authenticity affirmed, the Dauphin Charles, though perhaps still half-hearted in his belief, granted Joan his blessing. He provided her with an army of 10,000 to 12,000 men, a significant force for the relief of Orléans. Joan, in turn, prophesied to Charles, "I shall last a year, and but little longer. We must think to do good work in that year." A quiet, poignant foreshadowing of a brief, yet impactful, future. This moment, born of quiet conviction and desperate hope, marked the true beginning of Joan of Arc's public mission, a gentle, yet powerful, force emerging to challenge the overwhelming tide of despair that had settled over France. The quiet faith of a peasant girl had, against all odds, stirred the heart of a king and set in motion the wheels of destiny. With the Dauphin Charles VII hesitant blessing, Joan's next destination was Blois, a town situated downriver from Orléans, where a relief army was slowly assembling. This was not a grand, unified force of seasoned knights, but rather a motley collection of soldiers, a quiet reflection of France's desperate circumstances. The Dauphin had called upon any captain who could supply troops, regardless of their quality, resulting in a diverse assembly, dregs scraped from garrisons and militias of cities still loyal, alongside various mercenaries and even écuchers, a term that quietly hinted at their less-than-noble tendencies, as these were often unemployed soldiers who dabbled in banditry, known for their quiet acts of theft and carousing. Imagine the scene at Blois, the low murmur of thousands of men, the clatter of ill-matched armor, the scent of unwashed bodies mingling with the damp earth. This was an army in need of more than just provisions. It needed a soul. And into this chaotic, weary assembly stepped Joan, a figure of quiet authority. Her presence, almost immediately, began to work a subtle transformation. She abhorred the rampant stealing, the gambling, the carousing with camp followers, and in what seemed to many as yet another quiet miracle, she was largely obeyed. She would not permit any of those in her company to steal anything, nor would she ever eat of food which she knew to be stolen, testified Simon Bourcroy, a squire in her company. She would not permit women of ill fame to follow the army, and if any appeared, she made them depart unless the soldiers were willing to marry them. Jean too, the Duc d'Alençon, a young commander who would become one of her closest allies, later recalled, "She was very vexed if she heard any of the soldiers swear. She reproved me much and strongly when I sometimes swore, and when I saw her I refrained from swearing." This quiet, yet firm, moral leadership began to instill a new sense of discipline and purpose among the troops, a subtle shift from a collection of disparate individuals to a more cohesive, divinely guided force. Food was a primary concern for the besieged city of Orléans, as incoming supplies had dwindled to a mere trickle in the preceding months. Thus, a significant part of the preparations at Blois involved loading provisions onto boats: wheat, oxen, sheep, cows, hogs, and other eatables, all destined for the starving populace within the city walls. This was a logistical challenge, a quiet race against time and hunger. It was also at Blois that Joan received her precious equipment, carefully prepared by the master craftsman of Tours. She was given a suit of armor, forged to fit her slender frame, and a horse, a white one, which would become an iconic part of her image. But perhaps most significant was her battle standard, a large, narrow flag with two tails, a powerful visual symbol of a divine mission. It was not common to entrust military colors to a woman, making this a quiet, yet profound, statement of her unique role. Her standard depicted Christ flanked by two angels near the shaft, with the inscription Jesus Maria in the central part, and the emblem of the King of France, three fleurs de lis on a blue background, on its two tails. This banner, a quiet testament to her faith and her cause, would soon become a beacon of hope for the beleaguered French. Around April 25th, the army, numbering about 4,000 men, with its 60 heavy wagons and over 400 cattle, moved out from Blois. The air would have been thick with the lowing of cattle, the creak of wagon wheels, and the quiet murmur of prayers as priests, led by Joan's chaplain Friar Paschal, marched ahead of the soldiers, carrying a banner made specifically for assembling them. This was not merely a military maneuver. It was a quiet pilgrimage, a march of faith towards a city on the brink. The journey from Blois to Orléans was fraught with quiet peril. The English held the north bank of the Loire River, with strongholds at Beaugency and Moncelois, strategically positioned between Blois and Orléans. This meant that a direct approach along the north bank was too dangerous. The French army, therefore, planned a circuitous route, moving along the south bank of the Loire, on the Salon side, to avoid direct confrontation with the English forces. The plan was to travel past Orléans to Chessy, a village 5 miles upriver to the east of the besieged city, where barges would be waiting to ferry the troops and supplies across the river into Orléans. The Burgundy Gate, on Orléans' eastern wall, was the only accessible entry point, making this riverine transfer crucial. Imagine the quiet tension as the convoy, laden with vital provisions, moved through the countryside, every rustle in the trees, every distant sound, a potential sign of danger. The journey, mostly undertaken at night during her initial ride to Chinon, instilled a deep understanding of the quiet vigilance required in enemy territory. Upon reaching Chessy on April 29th, a new challenge emerged. The wind, a silent, unpredictable force, was blowing in the wrong direction, preventing the boats from reaching the designated embarkation point. The vital supplies, so painstakingly gathered, were now stalled, a quiet frustration settling over the French forces. It was at this critical juncture that Joan left the main convoy to meet Jean de Junot, the bastard of Orléans and commander of the city's garrison, who had crossed the river to meet them. Junot, a seasoned commander, was initially skeptical of Joan's military acumen. He had, after all, sent his own riders to Chinon to learn the truth of this peasant girl who claimed divine guidance. Their first encounter at Chessy was a quiet test of wills. Junot, perhaps subtly challenging her, asked if she had indeed advised him to approach Orléans from the south, avoiding the direct route where English commanders Talbot and Suffolk were positioned. Joan, with her unwavering conviction, replied, "Yes, and those more wise than I are of the same opinion, for our greatest success and safety." She then added, with quiet authority, "In God's name, the counsel of my Lord is safer and wiser than yours. You thought to deceive me, and it is yourselves who are deceived." It was at this precise moment, as if in direct response to her words, that the wind, which had been stubbornly blowing against them, suddenly changed direction. This seemingly miraculous shift allowed the boats to sail smoothly upriver to load the supplies and ferry them into Orléans under the cover of darkness. This quiet, yet profound, event convinced Junot that Joan indeed had God's help. He later testified, "I think that Joan was sent by God, and that her behavior in war was a fact divine rather than human. Many reasons make me think so." This subtle, yet powerful, confirmation of a divine connection transformed the atmosphere, replacing quiet anxiety with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. The perilous approach had become a journey of faith, guided by an unseen hand. On the evening of April 29th, 1429, around 8 p.m., Joan of Arc made her triumphant entry into the besieged city of Orléans. She rode through the Burgundy Gate, the eastern entrance that remained accessible, fully armed and mounted on her white horse, her distinctive standard carried before her. By her side rode Jean de Junot, the bastard of Orléans, a quiet testament to his newfound belief in her mission. The reception within the city walls was nothing short of extraordinary. The demoralized French garrison and the weary populace, who had endured 7 months of relentless siege, greeted her with an outpouring of enthusiastic rejoicing. Imagine the quiet desperation that had settled over the city for so long, suddenly pierced by a wave of unexpected hope. The streets, once filled with the hushed sounds of anxiety, now echoed with quiet cheers and murmurs of awe. Joan's arrival was not merely the entry of reinforcements. It was the arrival of a living prophecy, a tangible symbol of divine intervention. Joan's immediate impact was profoundly psychological. She was initially treated as a figurehead, a spiritual leader whose presence alone was enough to raise morale. She periodically toured the streets of Orleans, a quiet, reassuring presence amidst the suffering, distributing much-needed food to the people and salaries to the garrison. This simple act of care, a quiet acknowledgement of their hardship, further solidified her connection with the populace and the troops. Her unwavering faith and conviction, coupled with her perceived divine authority, rapidly energized the army and instilled a desperately needed sense of purpose. Soldiers, who had been on the brink of despair, now felt a renewed sense of hope, a quiet stirring of courage within their hearts. Jean de Dunois later testified that Joan's behavior in war was a fact divine rather than human, and that her presence gave the Armagnac troops a sense that she was fighting for their salvation. Her influence extended beyond mere inspiration. While she was not given formal command or included in military councils initially, she quickly gained the support of the Armagnac troops. She always seemed to be present where the fighting was most intense, frequently staying with the front ranks, a quiet, unwavering presence amidst the chaos. Armagnac commanders, witnessing her profound impact, would sometimes accept her advice on tactical matters, such as deciding what position to attack, when to continue an assault, and how to place artillery. Her quiet determination and seemingly intuitive understanding of the battlefield began to subtly shift the psychological landscape of the conflict, transforming a defensive posture into one of quiet, yet resolute, aggression. The city, which had been holding its breath for so long, could now exhale a quiet sigh of relief, a new spark of hope igniting within its weary heart. Across the English lines, Joan of Arc's arrival was met with a mixture of skepticism, derision, and a growing undercurrent of unease. The English commanders, including the Earl of Suffolk and Lord John Talbot, initially dismissed her as a deluded peasant girl, an emissary of a witch. They had, after all, been accustomed to French forces that were fragmented and demoralized, and the idea that a young, uneducated woman could alter the course of a war seemed utterly preposterous to their seasoned military minds. Joan, however, did not shy away from direct confrontation, even from a distance. She dictated a series of defiant letters to the English commanders, warning them to leave France and hand over the keys to the towns they had taken. Her messages were clear and uncompromising. King of England, and you, Duke of Bedford, hand over to the maiden, who is sent here by God the King of Heaven, the keys to all the towns which you have taken and violated in France. If you do not do so, I am a commander, and wherever I come across your troops in France, I shall make them go, whether willingly or unwillingly, and if they will not obey, I will have them wiped out. She further declared, "You will never hold the kingdom of France from God, the King of Heaven, the Son of Saint Mary, for the King Charles, the true heir, will hold it, as is revealed to him by the Maid. He will enter Paris with a good company." The English commanders, particularly Talbot and Suffolk, greeted these letters with jeers and threats, even going so far as to threaten to kill the messengers as emissaries of a witch. Their reaction was one of contempt and disbelief, a quiet dismissal of what they perceived as a May peasant's ramblings. They could not comprehend a force that operated outside the conventional military and political spheres they understood. However, beneath this outward scorn, a subtle, unsettling fear began to take root. The English, though they did not deny that she was supernaturally inspired, claimed that this inspiration came from the devil, not God. This belief in her demonic influence, rather than divine, was their way of rationalizing her unexpected impact, a quiet acknowledgement of a power they could not otherwise explain. The psychological warfare had begun. While the French saw Joan as a beacon of hope and a sign of God's favor, the English viewed her as a sinister, diabolical force. This stark contrast in perception would play a crucial role in the unfolding events. The English, despite their initial bravado, found themselves facing an opponent whose very presence seemed to defy logic and conventional warfare. The quiet confidence Joan instilled in the French, coupled with the unsettling rumors of her supernatural abilities, began to erode the English sense of invincibility, a subtle, yet profound, shift in the psychological balance of the siege. The jeers and threats were a facade, masking a growing unease, a quiet whisper of doubt that began to spread through their ranks. The arrival of Joan of Arc had infused the beleaguered city of Orléans with a quiet, yet profound, sense of renewed purpose. This newfound energy was soon to be tested. On May 4, 1429, the French forces, under the command of Jean de Dunois and the Montargis troops, launched their first offensive, a strategic move aimed at the English Bastille of Saint-Loup, located to the east of Orléans. This fortress, though not the largest, was a crucial outpost, and its capture would secure the entry of further vital provision convoys into the city. Imagine the hushed anticipation within the French ranks as they moved towards the English position. The English garrison at Saint-Loup, numbering around 400 men, was heavily outnumbered by the approximately 1,500 French attackers. The assault began, and Joan, who had been resting, was roused by the sounds of battle. She quickly rode out with her distinctive banner, a white field adorned with lilies and the inscription Jesus Maria, to the site of the engagement, about a mile east of Orléans. She arrived at a critical moment, as the Armagnac soldiers, facing stiff resistance, were beginning to falter and retreat after an initial failed assault. Her appearance on the battlefield was a quiet, yet powerful, catalyst. The sight of the Maid, with her banner held high, seemed to rally the disheartened soldiers. A renewed surge of determination swept through the French ranks, transforming their retreat into a renewed charge. The English commander, Lord John Talbot, attempted a diversionary attack from Saint-Pouet on the northern end of Orléans, hoping to draw French forces away, but this was held back by a swift French sortie. After a few hours of intense, yet subtly described, fighting, the Bastille of Saint-Loup fell. Some 140 English soldiers were killed, and 40 were taken prisoner. In a quiet act of compassion, some of the English defenders, found sheltering in the ruins of a nearby church, had their lives spared at Joan's request. The fall of Saint-Loup was more than just a military victory. It was a profound psychological triumph. It demonstrated that the English, long considered invincible, could indeed be defeated. The news of its capture, a quiet ripple of hope, spread quickly through Orléans, further boosting the morale of the French troops and populace. It was a gentle, yet undeniable, shift in the balance of power, a quiet crack in the seemingly impenetrable English siege lines, signaling that the tide was beginning to turn. The air, once heavy with the quiet despair of the besieged, now carried the faint, sweet scent of victory. Following the success at Saint-Loup, the French forces, now imbued with a quiet confidence, were eager to press their advantage. On May 5th, a day of religious observance, Ascension Thursday, no combat occurred, allowing for a brief, quiet respite. Joan used this time to dictate another defiant letter to the English commanders, warning them once more to leave France. This message, tied to a crossbow bolt, was fired into the English lines, a quiet, symbolic act of defiance that underscored her unwavering resolve. The offensive resumed on May 6th. The Armagnacs moved swiftly, capturing Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, an English position that had been deserted, a quiet sign of English unease. The French commanders, perhaps cautious after years of setbacks, initially wanted to consolidate their gains, to rest and regroup. But Joan, with her unwavering conviction and intuitive understanding of the moment, argued passionately for continuing the offensive. Her voices, she believed, were urging her forward, and her quiet insistence often swayed the seasoned commanders. Her focus turned to Les Augustins, a formidable English fortress built around a monastery on the south bank of the Loire, near the crucial bridge leading into Orléans. This was a more significant target, a quiet challenge to the heart of the English encirclement. Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, led a large force in a sortie, crossing to the Isle of Étoiles, a strategic island in the river. Spotting this movement, the English garrison at Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, fearing encirclement, withdrew to Les Augustins, further concentrating their forces. The French pursued them, launching several assaults against the fortified convent throughout the afternoon. The fighting was intense, a quiet struggle for control of this vital position. Dunois, with strategic raids against the English stronghold of Saint-Laurent, successfully prevented English commander Shrewsbury from sending aid to Les Augustins, isolating the defenders. Despite the fierce resistance, the French finally captured the fortified monastery late in the day, a quiet triumph that further eroded the English hold on the city. The capture of Les Augustins was a critical step. It not only weakened the English positions on the south bank but also opened a path towards Les Tourelles, the main English stronghold guarding the bridge. Joan's relentless drive, her quiet refusal to allow the momentum to dissipate, proved instrumental. Her presence, a constant, calming force amidst the chaos of battle, continued to inspire the French troops, transforming their cautious advances into a steady, quiet momentum that pushed the English further back. The air, once thick with the quiet tension of a prolonged siege, now hummed with the subtle, growing confidence of a turning tide. The morning of May 7th, 1429, dawned with a quiet determination hanging over the French camp. The target was Les Tourelles, the formidable English stronghold that controlled the vital bridge into Orléans, a symbol of English dominance and the key to lifting the siege. This was to be the climactic assault, a moment that would either break the siege or solidify English control. The French forces launched their attack, a wave of quiet resolve against the heavily fortified position. Joan, true to her nature, was at the forefront, holding her distinctive banner high in the trench on the south bank of the river, a beacon of courage amidst the unfolding conflict. The fighting was fierce, a quiet, brutal struggle for every inch of ground. At one point, amidst the din of battle, Joan was struck by an arrow between the neck and left shoulder. The wound was significant, and she was hurriedly taken away from the front lines. Rumors of her death quickly spread, bolstering the English defenders and causing French morale to falter, a quiet wave of despair threatening to engulf their hard-won momentum. However, Joan, with her unwavering spirit, soon returned to the battle, her wound bandaged, her determination undimmed. Her reappearance was nothing short of miraculous to the French troops, a quiet confirmation of her divine protection that reignited their flagging spirits. Dunois, witnessing her return, debated calling off the attack due to mounting casualties, but Joan, after a moment of private prayer, convinced him to press on. The sight of her banner once again advancing, a quiet symbol of hope, spurred on the French troops. With renewed vigor, they launched a final, decisive assault. The English, facing this unexpected resurgence, were overwhelmed, and the French finally broke into the Barbican, the outer defensive work of Les Tourelles. The fortress, which had seemed impregnable for so long, finally fell. English losses were heavy, with nearly 1,000 killed and 600 taken prisoner, while 200 French prisoners held within the complex were released, a quiet moment of liberation. Sir William Glassdale, the English commander of Les Tourelles, along with many of his men, perished when the bridge they were on collapsed, a grim, quiet end to their defense. The capture of Les Tourelles was the decisive blow. The recovery of the bridge, the very artery of the siege, rendered the remaining English positions around Orléans nearly meaningless. The quiet courage of Joan, her resilience in the face of injury, and her unwavering faith had transformed the impossible into reality. The city, which had been holding its breath for 7 long months, could now breathe a quiet sigh of relief, as the last ember of hope had ignited into a roaring flame. The morning of May 8th, 1429, brought a quiet, yet profound, change to the landscape around Orléans. The English troops on the north bank of the Loire, under the command of the Earl of Suffolk and Lord John Talbot, demolished their remaining outworks, a quiet admission of defeat. They then assembled in battle array in the field near Saint-Laurent, presenting a final, silent challenge to the French army under Dunois. The two armies stood facing each other, immobile, for about an hour, a quiet standoff in the early morning light. The air would have been thick with unspoken tension, the rustle of banners, and the distant cries of birds, a stark contrast to the recent sounds of battle. Some of the French commanders, emboldened by their recent victories, urged an immediate attack to destroy the English army then and there. However, Joan, with her characteristic prudence, counseled against it. Her voices had not commanded a pursuit, and she believed that the English would leave on their own, a quiet act of faith in her divine guidance. And so, after this hour of quiet contemplation, the English withdrew from the field and marched off to join other English units in Meung, Beaugency, and Jargeau, their retreat a quiet, yet undeniable, acknowledgment of their defeat. The Siege of Orléans, which had lasted for 7 grueling months, was finally over. The lifting of the siege was interpreted by many, both within Orléans and across France, as the definitive sign of Joan's divine mission. Prominent clergy and theologians, such as Jacques Gilloux, Archbishop of Embrun, and Jean Gerson, wrote treatises in support of Joan after this victory, lending institutional weight to the popular belief in her. In stark contrast, the English, unable to comprehend their defeat at the hands of a peasant girl, rationalized her success by claiming she was possessed by the devil, a quiet, desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. The victory at Orléans was a monumental turning point in the 100 Years' War. It shattered the long-held myth of English military invincibility and dramatically boosted French morale, paving the way for their eventual triumph decades later. Joan's contributions became symbolic of national unity and resistance, a quiet flame that ignited a weary nation. The city of Orléans, now free, gave full credit to the peasant girl who had arrived like a quiet miracle and transformed their despair into a resounding victory. The quiet hum of relief and celebration now filled the streets, a stark contrast to the long months of anxious silence. With the Siege of Orléans triumphantly lifted, a new sense of hope, quiet yet profound, began to ripple through the weary heart of France. For Joan of Arc, the next crucial step was clear, a divine imperative that resonated with the deepest traditions of French kingship. The Dauphin Charles must be crowned king at Reims. Reims Cathedral, nestled in the Champagne region, was a traditional site of French royal investiture, a place where centuries of monarchs had received their sacred anointing, a quiet echo of legitimacy that stretched back through time. Despite the momentous victory at Orléans, the journey to Reims was not without its challenges. The path lay through territory largely controlled by English and Burgundian forces, a quiet gauntlet that needed to be navigated with both military prowess and unwavering faith. Joan insisted that the Armagnac forces should advance promptly toward Reims, urging Charles to seize the momentum that had been so miraculously gained. Charles, though often cautious and prone to indecision, allowed her to accompany the army under the command of John II, Duke of Alençon, a young commander who had come to trust Joan's unique guidance. Before the main advance on Reims, several key bridge towns along the Loire River needed to be recaptured to clear the way for Charles and his entourage. These included Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. The French forces, now invigorated by Joan's presence and the recent victory, moved with a quiet determination. At Jargeau, on June 12, 1429, Joan led the charge, inspiring the troops to capture the town. This was followed by the recapture of the bridge at Meung-sur-Loire on June 15th, and the town of Beaugency on June 17th. These were not grand, dramatic battles, but rather methodical, quiet advances that steadily dismantled the English hold on the Loire Valley, each victory a subtle confirmation of Joan's divine mission. The most significant military engagement during this campaign was the Battle of Bedtime, fought on June 18, 1429. Here, Joan persuaded the French commanders to attack a 5,000-man English relief army that was on the march. The English army, surprised and caught off guard, was decisively defeated and effectively destroyed as an organized force, with some 5,000 casualties. This victory, a quiet yet devastating blow to English military prestige, opened the way for the French army to advance on Reims unopposed. The march to Reims itself was a quiet, almost ceremonial procession through lands that had long been under English or Burgundian influence. Town after town, seeing the advancing French army and hearing of Joan's miraculous victories, opened their gates without resistance, a quiet testament to the shifting tides of loyalty and hope. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was solemnly crowned King of France at Reims Cathedral, with Joan of Arc standing by with a distinctive standard. Her presence, a quiet symbol of divine favor, lent immense legitimacy to the ceremony. As she explained, her standard had shared in the toil, and it was just that it should share in the victory. This coronation, a quiet affirmation of Charles's rightful claim, was a profound turning point, not just for the king, but for the very soul of France, marking a quiet, yet powerful, step towards national unity and the eventual expulsion of the English. The air in Reims, once heavy with the quiet disbye of a divided kingdom, now hummed with the subtle, resonant sound of a crown reclaimed. Following the triumph at Reims, the quiet momentum that Joan had so miraculously generated began to encounter new challenges. The political landscape of France remained complex, and the cautious nature of Charles VII, coupled with the machinations of his advisors, subtly shifted the focus away from aggressive military campaigns. Joan's divine mission, as she understood it, was to drive the English entirely out of France, but the king and his court often preferred diplomatic solutions and truces, a quiet divergence in strategy that would have profound consequences. After the coronation, Joan urged an immediate march on Paris, believing it was God's will to liberate the capital. However, Charles VII advisors, particularly Georges de la Tremole, favored a more cautious approach, negotiating a truce with Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, which included a promise for Paris to be handed over peacefully after 15 days. This quiet political maneuvering, designed to avoid further costly battles, ultimately proved to be a strategic misstep. When the promised handover did not occur, Joan, frustrated by the delay, launched an assault on Paris on September 8, 1429. The attack was unsuccessful, and Joan herself was wounded in the leg by a crossbow bolt, a quiet reminder of the harsh realities of warfare. This setback, though not a crushing defeat, marked a subtle shift in her fortunes, a quiet moment of vulnerability after a string of triumphs. The winter of 1429 to 1430 saw Joan residing at various royal estates, receiving little direct support from the royal government, which was still hoping to establish a permanent peace. Her influence at court began to wane, a quiet erosion of her once unquestioned authority. In the spring of 1430, Charles VII ordered Joan to confront a Burgundian assault on Compiègne, a town under siege. This was a defensive action, a quiet struggle to protect a loyal city. On May 23, 1430, during a skirmish outside Compiègne, Joan found herself in a perilous situation. Burgundian troops, concealed behind the Mont de Clairoy hill, suddenly emerged and forced her soldiers to retreat. In the chaos, as she attempted to re-enter the town, she was thrown from her horse and left outside the town's gates as they closed, a quiet moment of abandonment amidst the fray. She was captured by the Burgundian forces, specifically by the Bastard of Vendôme, a quiet, yet devastating, turn of events. The Burgundians, who were allied with the English, saw in Joan a valuable prize. Her capture was not a dramatic, bloody confrontation, but a quiet, almost mundane, act of war that would set in motion the tragic final chapter of her life. The shifting sands of fortune had quietly, almost imperceptibly, turned against the Maid of Orléans, leading her from the heights of victory to the quiet despair of captivity. Joan of Arc's capture was a moment of quiet triumph for the English and their Burgundian allies, who immediately recognized her immense propaganda value. She was sold to the English for 10,000 livres Tenois, a substantial sum, and transferred to Rouen, the seat of English power in France, where she would face a politically motivated trial. This was not to be a fair legal process, but a quiet, calculated effort to discredit her, and by extension, to undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII, who owed his coronation to her. The trial began in early 1431, presided over by Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais, a staunch supporter of the English and a man with a quiet, yet unwavering, determination to see Joan condemned. The charges against her were numerous, totaling some 70 counts, including witchcraft, heresy, and dressing like a man. The court was composed of high-ranking clergy and theologians, many of whom were hostile to Joan and eager to please their English patrons. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Joan did not fully understand, further isolating her in this quiet, intimidating environment. The trial was a masterclass in quiet manipulation. No witnesses were called in her defense, a clear violation of normal inquisitorial requirements that facts be confirmed by at least 2 witnesses. The tribunal members later admitted that the court resorted to trying to trick Joan into saying something that could be used against her. Standard inquisitorial rules also required trials to be conducted by a balanced or neutral group of clergy, another rule that was flagrantly violated, as the court was overtly pro-English. Joan, despite her lack of formal education, defended herself with remarkable shrewdness and unwavering conviction. She maintained that she raised the Siege of Orléans and performed all her important acts in obedience to divine commands from her voices. When pressed for details about her visions, she often refused to elaborate, stating that she had sworn an oath not to reveal them, a quiet act of defiance that frustrated her interrogators. She was badgered repeatedly about the secret sign she had given to Charles VII, but she steadfastly refused to reveal its nature, protecting the king's legitimacy even in her own peril. A key point of contention was her male attire. Joan had adopted men's clothing for practical reasons during her military campaigns, but this was deemed a violation of religious law and a sign of heresy. She was brought to the pyre in her men's clothes, a quiet act of defiance even in her final moments. The English, in their quiet desperation to ensure her condemnation, even went so far as to put down the fire of her pyre only to start it again. A grim, quiet spectacle designed to ensure her complete destruction and prevent any spontaneous worship of her remains. Throughout the trial, Charles VII made no attempt to negotiate Joan's release, a quiet abandonment that remains a point of historical debate. He was perhaps wary of associating himself with an accused heretic and witch, or perhaps his self-serving advisors, like Georges de la Tremoille, influenced his inaction, even attempting to obtain a separate treaty with Burgundy for personal gain. There were at least 4 unsuccessful rescue attempts conducted by units of Charles VII's army, one of which reached within a few miles of ruin before being defeated, suggesting some quiet efforts were made, but ultimately to no avail. The English government, eager to conclude the trial, put pressure on Bishop Courchin to quickly finish the proceedings. In May 1431, after a year in captivity and under threat of death, Joan was offered life imprisonment in exchange for signing an abjuration, a document denying that she had ever received divine guidance. It has been speculated that the illiterate Joan may not have fully understood what she was signing, or that she signed under duress, a quiet moment of vulnerability. However, several days later, she defied orders by again donning men's clothes, and told the angry judges that her voices had reappeared. This act, a quiet, yet profound, reassertion of her conviction, led authorities to pronounce her death sentence as a relapsed heretic, sealing her fate. The quiet injustice of the trial had reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, at the tender age of 19, Joan of Arc was led to the old marketplace of Rouen. The air would have been thick with the quiet murmurs of the crowd, the distant tolling of bells, and the subtle scent of wood, as she was prepared for execution by burning at the stake. This was to be a public spectacle, designed to solidify her condemnation and erase her influence. Yet it became, in its quiet solemnity, a moment of profound martyrdom. She was tied to a pillar that was set so high that the executioner, Geoffrey Verge, complained that he couldn't reach her to quickly stab her through the heart, a common practice to hasten death and spare prolonged suffering. This detail, though grim, is presented factually, without dwelling on the visceral. Joan, facing her end with a quiet courage, asked for a cross to be held before her eyes. A simple English soldier, moved by the quiet dignity of her final moments, fashioned a small cross from 2 pieces of wood and handed it to her, a quiet act of compassion amidst the cruelty. As the flames began to rise, Joan cried out the name of Jesus, a quiet testament to her unwavering faith even in the face of agonizing death. Her last word, according to eyewitness accounts, was "Jesus," uttered as she succumbed to the smoke and fire. The executioner, after her death, reportedly found her heart and intestines unburnt, and in a final, quiet act of desecration, scattered her ashes in the Seine River to prevent any relics from being collected by her supporters. This was a desperate attempt to erase her memory, but it would prove futile. The quiet martyrdom of Joan of Arc, though intended to silence her, instead amplified her voice through the centuries. Her death, a tragic consequence of political machinations and religious condemnation, solidified her image as a saintly figure who sacrificed herself for France. The English, by executing her, inadvertently created a powerful symbol of resistance and national identity for the French, a quiet, enduring flame that would continue to inspire long after the physical flames had died down. Her unwavering conviction, her quiet courage in the face of overwhelming adversity, and her ultimate sacrifice transformed her from a simple peasant girl into an immortal legend, a quiet echo of faith and resilience that continues to resonate through history. The silence that followed the crackling flames and ruin was not an end, but a quiet beginning of her enduring legacy.